Picture this. It's 12,000 years ago, and you're standing on a windswept hill watching hunters track a herd of red deer across an endless plain. Behind you, rivers snake through valleys thick with birch and pine. Ahead, the deer disappear into morning mist rolling across grasslands that stretch to the horizon. You can hear the distant calls of cranes, the splash of salmon in the river below. This is good country, rich country. Your people have lived here for thousands of years, following the herds, fishing the rivers, gathering plants that grow in abundance along the wetlands. Here's the thing, though. You're not standing in England. You're not in the Netherlands or Denmark either. You're standing in the middle of what we now call the North Sea, right where oil rigs drill today, where cargo ships pass, where waves crash and storms rage. You're standing on Doggerland, Britain's Atlantis, except this one was real. Today, if you sail from England to the Netherlands, you're crossing about 350 miles of open water. But for most of human history, there was no water there at all. There was land, vast, populated, thriving land, forests and rivers and lakes, communities of hunter-gatherers who built lives in a landscape that has since vanished so completely that we forgot it ever existed. Until recently, nobody knew Doggerland was even there. Sure, fishermen would occasionally dredge up weird stuff from the North Sea floor, mammoth teeth, ancient tools, bones from animals that had no business being underwater. But it wasn't until the last few decades that we realised what we were looking at. The remains of a drowned world, an entire lost country that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, home to thousands of people, swallowed by the sea so slowly that nobody alive today remembered it ever happened. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make these. So subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check comments, and it's fascinating. Tokyo at dawn, London at midnight, Los Angeles at bedtime, all at once. The story of Doggerland isn't just about a land bridge that disappeared. It's about the end of an era, the last time humans could walk from London to Berlin without getting their feet wet. It's about communities who watched their world shrink generation by generation as the waters crept higher. And it's about one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in European prehistory, a tsunami so massive it wiped out coastal settlements across the North Sea in a matter of hours. For 15,000 years, Doggerland was the heartland of northern Europe. Not the edge, not the periphery, the centre. While Britain was a frozen wasteland clinging to the edge of the ice sheets, Doggerland was where life happened. As the ice retreated and the world warmed, this submerged landscape became one of the richest hunting grounds in Europe. Massive herds of aurochs, wild horses and deer, rivers thick with salmon and pike, wetlands teeming with birds. Archaeological evidence suggests it was densely populated, crisscrossed with the camps and hunting grounds of Mesolithic people, who had no idea their entire world was living on borrowed time. The thing that gets me about Doggerland is how completely it vanished. We're not talking about ruins you can visit, like Pompeii or Machu Picchu. We're talking about an inhabited landscape the size of England that's now under 60 feet of water. Imagine if California just slowly sank into the Pacific over 5,000 years. That's Doggerland. Except the people living through it didn't have written records or maps or any way to know what was happening. They just noticed the coast kept moving. The good fishing spots their grandparents talked about were now underwater. The river crossings kept getting deeper. The islands kept getting smaller. By 6,200 years ago, it was over. Britain became an island, the land bridge was gone, and an entire chapter of human history was buried beneath the waves, forgotten for 8,000 years. But the sea keeps its secrets badly, and in the last 30 years scientists have started recovering them. What they've found is extraordinary. Picture this. It's 20,000 years ago. You're standing where London would one day be, but there's no Thames, No city, no Thames estuary. There's nothing but ice. Ice stretching in every direction as far as you can see. Ice 2 miles thick pressing down on the land with the weight of mountains. Ice that has been building layer upon frozen layer for thousands of years. This is the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, the moment when Earth's climate crisis reached its coldest point, and nearly a third of the planet's land surface disappeared under glaciers. But here's what makes this moment so important for our story. All that ice had to come from somewhere, and it came from the oceans. Every snowflake that fell on those growing ice sheets was water that had been evaporated from the seas, transported thousands of miles by atmospheric circulation, then locked away as ice. Year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium. The oceans were being drained. Sea levels were dropping at a rate that would seem catastrophic if it happened today. 1 metre every few hundred years doesn't sound like much, but let that continue for 10,000 years, and you're talking about transformations that remake entire continents. And that's exactly what was happening. As the ice sheets thickened over Scandinavia, over Scotland, over northern Britain, the North Sea was dying, not all at once, not everywhere, but slowly, year by year. Coastlines were marching outward, exposing land that had been underwater for over 100,000 years. By the time the last glacial maximum arrived, sea levels had dropped 120 metres. That's 400 feet. That's a 40-storey building. That's enough to completely transform the geography of Northern Europe. The English Channel, that narrow strip of water that now separates Britain from France, was gone. Completely dry. What had been a shallow sea became a river valley, a deep canyon carved by the combined waters of the Thames and the Rhine, cutting through the exposed continental shelf on their way to a North Sea that had retreated hundreds of miles to the north. And between Britain and Denmark, where fishing trawlers now drag nets through cold waters 30 to 40 metres deep, there was land. Solid, dry, increasingly habitable land. Doggerland was being born, not all at once. The process took thousands of years, and it wasn't simple or straightforward. As sea levels dropped, different parts of the continental shelf emerged at different times. The highest areas, ancient ridges and hills that had been just barely submerged during warmer periods, these appeared first. Islands in a shrinking sea, highlands surrounded by marshes and tidal flats. Then the lower areas started emerging, broad plains that had been seafloor for millennia, now exposed to air and sunlight for the first time in living memory. Well, living memory for any species that had a memory that long. The newly exposed land was raw, fresh, almost alien. Imagine being one of the first humans to walk on ground that had been ocean floor a few generations earlier. The sediments would still be marine deposits, shells and sand, maybe the occasional fossil of ancient marine life. There would be no soil yet, no plants, just bare substrate waiting to be colonized. But colonization happened fast. Nature abhors a vacuum, and evolution had spent billions of years perfecting species that could exploit new opportunities quickly. The pioneer species came first. Lichens, those remarkable symbiotic partnerships between fungi and algae, capable of growing on bare rock and slowly breaking it down into soil. Mosses, able to survive in the thin layer of organic matter created by dying lichens. Then grasses, their wind-distributed seeds capable of travelling hundreds of miles, germinating anywhere conditions were even marginally suitable. Within decades, not centuries, but decades, the exposed plains were turning green. Sparse at first, just scattered patches of vegetation in the most sheltered locations, but spreading. Year by year, season by season, life was reclaiming land that had been lost to the sea, and the landscape that emerged was extraordinary. Doggerland at its maximum extent was huge, bigger than modern Britain, maybe 100,000 square miles of land connecting Britain to continental Europe. That's an area roughly the size of the entire British Isles or the state of Oregon. It wasn't just a narrow bridge, it was a country, a vast, diverse landscape with its own geography, its own climate, its own character. The western portions, closest to what is now the British coast, were probably hillier. These were areas where harder bedrock formations created natural ridges and valleys, ancient river systems that had been drowned when sea levels rose during previous warm periods. Now these were being excavated again, carved deeper by rainfall and seasonal flooding. In some areas, you would have found steep river valleys cutting through chalk and limestone hills. In others, gentler landscapes of rolling downs covered in developing grassland. The central plains were different. Flatter, more open, characterized by enormous river systems that drain the melting edges of the glaciers hundreds of miles to the north. The Rhine was there, much larger than its modern incarnation, fed by countless tributaries collecting water from across northern Europe. The Thames was there too, joining with the Rhine in a massive confluence somewhere in the middle of what's now the North Sea. These weren't small rivers. They were continental-scale waterways, hundreds of meters wide, carrying enormous volumes of glacial meltwater and sediment. And where those rivers flooded, which they did regularly seasonally, they created some of the richest habitats on Earth. Floodplain ecosystems are biodiversity factories. The seasonal inundation deposits nutrient-rich sediments. The presence of year-round water supports lush vegetation. The combination of aquatic and terrestrial habitats creates ecological complexity that can support incredible numbers of species. The eastern portions of Doggerland, furthest from Britain, graded into what's now the Netherlands, Denmark and northern Germany. These areas were probably lower lying, characterized by extensive wetlands and marshes, places where the rivers slowed and spread out, creating vast networks of channels and pools. Think of the Florida Everglades, but bigger and in a colder climate. Reed beds stretching for miles, willow thickets along stream channels, open water in the deepest areas, supporting fish and waterfowl. And to the north, the landscape would have been more dramatic. The great ice sheets were still there, even if they were beginning their slow retreat. You would have been able to see them on clear days, brilliant white walls of ice rising on the horizon, and from those ice fronts came the rivers, grey with suspended rock flour ground from the bedrock by billions of tons of moving ice. The sound must have been incredible during summer melts. The roar of water, the crash of ice carving from glacier fronts, the crack and groan of ice under pressure. The climate during this period was harsh, no question. Even though Doggerland itself wasn't buried under ice, it was right at the edge of the glacial zone. Winters were long and brutal, temperatures that could drop to -20, -30 Celsius, snow that could last from October through April, frozen ground hard as concrete. But summers, brief as they were, would have been surprisingly productive. With nearly 24 hours of daylight at high latitudes, plants could photosynthesize almost continuously during the growing season. Temperatures could reach 15, even 20 degrees Celsius on warm days. The combination of long daylight and abundant fresh water from melting snow created intense bursts of biological productivity. Grasses grew fast and thick during these summer months. Wildflowers exploded in waves of colour. Insects hatched in clouds so dense they darkened the sky. And all this productivity created opportunities for larger organisms. The herbivores came next, following the spreading grasslands, moving north from refuges in southern Europe and Asia, where they had survived the worst of the glaciation. Horses were among the first. Small, stocky Ice Age horses adapted to cold climates and sparse vegetation. Not the graceful thoroughbreds we know today, but tough, hardy animals with thick coats and powerful builds. They could paw through snow to reach buried grass, survive on minimal forage during long winters, then fatten up quickly during brief summer abundance. Reindeer came too, or caribou as they're called in North America, perfectly adapted to Arctic and subarctic conditions, capable of digesting lichens when nothing else was available, able to migrate hundreds of miles following seasonal vegetation changes. They moved in huge herds, thousands of animals following ancient migration routes from winter, feeding grounds to summer calving areas. And where herbivores went, predators followed. Wolves, tracking the reindeer herds, working in packs to bring down animals much larger than themselves. Arctic foxes, smaller but no less deadly, specializing in smaller prey and scavenging what larger predators left behind. The rivers and wetlands had their own ecosystems developing, pike and salmon navigating the river systems, otters hunting along stream banks, beavers beginning to colonize suitable habitat, their dam building creating even more wetland complexity. Birds were everywhere. Waterfowl by the millions during spring and autumn migrations, using Doggerland as a stopover between wintering grounds in southern Europe and breeding territories in the far north. Geese, ducks, swans, all converging on these rich wetlands to rest and feed before continuing their journeys. This wasn't just empty land being exposed by falling sea levels. This was an ecosystem assembling itself in real time. Every year, new species arrived from the south. Every generation, those species adapted more completely to local conditions. Within a few thousand years, Doggerland had transformed from barren seafloor to one of the richest habitats in northern Europe. But it was still early, still raw, still harsh. The climate was improving slowly as the last glacial maximum passed and Earth began its long, irregular warming toward the present interglacial period. But this was still fundamentally an Ice Age landscape, still dominated by cold, by seasonality, by the proximity of those massive glaciers to the north, and, importantly, there were still no humans. Not yet. The people who would eventually colonize Doggerland were still far to the south, still surviving in refuges where the Ice Age had been less brutal. They were developing the technologies they would need, refining the social systems that would allow them to survive in harsh environments, becoming the kind of people who could look at this vast, cold, dangerous landscape and see opportunity instead of threat. But they were coming. Within a few thousand years, as the climate continued to improve and the ice sheets began their final retreat, humans would arrive in Doggerland, and when they did, they would find a land bridge connecting two continents, a highway running from the plains of Europe to the emerging islands of Britain, a rich, productive landscape teeming with game and resources. They would find paradise, at least for a while. Because Doggerland's story, like all stories of this world, was temporary. The same forces that had created it, those massive glaciers locking water away from the oceans, were already beginning to reverse. The ice was melting, slowly at first, then faster. And as it melted, the seas were rising, coming back to reclaim what they had lost, but that was still thousands of years in the future. For now, Doggerland was growing, expanding, becoming more livable with each passing century. The stage was set. The landscape was ready. All it needed was people, and they were already on their way. Picture a world without the North Sea, no channel separating Britain from Europe, no Danish coastline, no Dutch harbours, no Belgian beaches. Instead, imagine a vast plain stretching from what is now Yorkshire all the way to Denmark and the Netherlands. Rolling grasslands cut by massive rivers, dotted with lakes and wetlands, surrounded by forests of birch and pine. This was Doggerland, and around 12,000 BCE, as the last ice age finally loosened its grip on northern Europe, The first humans walked onto this landscape and found something they'd been searching for their entire lives. Paradise. Not paradise in the modern sense. These weren't people looking for comfortable lives. They were late Paleolithic hunters, descendants of populations that had spent thousands of years sheltering in southern refuges, waiting for the ice to retreat. They had survived by being tough, adaptable, and relentlessly focused on one thing: following the herds, because where the animals went, survival followed. And as the glaciers pulled back, the animals came north. Massive herds of reindeer, wild horses and aurochs, the gigantic wild cattle that would roam Europe for another 10,000 years. They followed the expanding grasslands, moving into territories that had been buried under ice sheets a mile thick just a few thousand years earlier. And behind them, never more than a few days' travel away, came the hunters. These weren't large groups. Population genetics and archaeological evidence tell us they travelled in bands of maybe 20 to 30 people. Extended families, basically. A few adult men, a few adult women, children of various ages, maybe an elderly person or two if they were lucky enough to live that long. Put more people together and you'd exhaust the local resources too quickly. Go smaller and you'd lack the numbers to bring down large game or defend against predators. 20 to 30 was the sweet spot tested by evolution over hundreds of thousands of years. It worked. When these first bands walked onto what would become Doggerland, they must have thought they'd discovered the richest territory on Earth, and they wouldn't have been wrong. Doggerland wasn't just good hunting ground, it was the best hunting ground in Europe. Here's why. First, the geography. Doggerland sat at the convergence of multiple major river systems. The Thames, which now empties into the sea south of London, flowed east across the plain for another 100 miles before joining with the Rhine. The Rhine itself, already one of Europe's mightiest rivers, carved through the heart of Doggerland before turning north. Other rivers, ones that don't exist anymore, ones whose names we'll never know, drained from the melting ice sheets and created a vast network of freshwater arteries. Rivers meant life. They provided drinking water, obviously, but more importantly they created corridors of rich habitat. River valleys in the late Paleolithic were like highways of abundance. Trees grew along the banks providing nuts, fruits, and building materials. Fish filled the waters, salmon and pike and species we'd barely recognize today. Birds nested in uncountable numbers, migrating waterfowl that would darken the sky during seasonal movements. And the animals, the big game that humans depended on, they congregated along rivers too. Because that's where the best grazing was, where water was reliable, where life was easiest. The humans just had to show up and take advantage. Second, the sheer size of it. Doggerland at its maximum extent covered an area larger than modern England. We're talking about 100,000 square miles of prime hunting territory. No ownership, no borders, no competing human populations fighting over every scrap. Just endless landscape waiting to be explored and exploited. For people who had spent generations in crowded southern refuges, this must have felt like discovering a new world. Third, the strategic location. Doggerland wasn't isolated, it was connected. To the south, it merged gradually with what is now France and Belgium. To the east, it joined with Denmark and the North European plain. To the west, it rose into hills that would eventually become the British Isles. But at this point were just the western edge of a continuous landmass. This meant Doggerland became a crossroads, a meeting place where human populations from different regions could encounter each other, exchange knowledge, trade goods, find marriage partners. This might not sound important, but it was crucial. Those late Paleolithic bands needed genetic diversity to stay viable. They needed new ideas to adapt to changing conditions. Doggerland's central location made it a hub of human activity, a place where innovations could spread and populations could thrive. So they came, probably not in one big migration, more likely in waves, small bands following the herds north, finding good territory and staying, then more bands arriving, spreading out, finding their own territories. Within a few centuries, maybe a millennium, Doggerland was populated by dozens of these small groups, each maintaining their own territory, but connected through kinship networks and occasional meetings. What was life actually like for these first Doggerland inhabitants? Brutal, rewarding, never boring. Everything revolved around the seasonal cycle, because Doggerland, despite its abundance, wasn't consistent year-round. Winters were still harsh. Not Ice Age harsh, but cold enough that survival required planning and skill. Summer was the season of plenty. The herds were at their maximum, fattened on rich grass. Fish were spawning in the rivers. Birds were nesting. Plant foods, roots and berries and edible greens were abundant. This was when the hunting bands did most of their serious work. They needed to kill enough animals not just to eat immediately, but to preserve for winter. They needed to gather plant foods that could be stored. They needed to collect raw materials, flint for tools, wood for spears and shelters, animal sinews for cordage, hides for clothing. Autumn was processing season, taking all the summer's bounty and preparing it for storage, drying meat over smoking fires, scraping and treating hides, extracting marrow from bones and rendering fat, both incredibly valuable sources of calories that could last months if stored properly. Winter was survival mode. Groups probably gathered in semi-permanent camps, often in river valleys, where they'd have protection from wind and access to water. They lived off stored foods, supplemented by whatever hunting they could manage. This was when people died, children especially, but also adults if the hunting had been poor or if disease struck. Winter was the population bottleneck, the season that kept human numbers in check. Spring was renewal, the herds returning, the fish running up rivers to spawn, the first green plants emerging. This was when bands might break up, individual families going their separate ways to follow different herds or explore new territories. It was also when groups would sometimes meet, travelling to traditional gathering spots to trade, share information, and find partners for their adolescent children. The archaeological evidence for all this comes from an unlikely source, the bottom of the North Sea, because when Doggerland finally flooded, it didn't destroy everything, it buried it. Under layers of sediment and sand preserved by cold water and absence of oxygen, the artifacts of these first inhabitants waited for thousands of years. Starting in the early 20th century, fishing trawlers began bringing them up. At first, nobody understood what they were finding. Strange stones, obviously worked by human hands but dredged from deep water. Bone tools with edges worn smooth by use. Harpoon points carved from antler, their barbs still sharp after 14,000 years underwater. The fishermen called them Morfunden moorland finds, assuming they came from submerged peat bogs. It took decades before archaeologists realized what they actually had. Evidence of an entire drowned world, a landscape that had supported human populations for thousands of years before the sea swallowed it. The artifacts tell us remarkable things about those first Doggerland inhabitants. The worked flints show sophisticated tool-making techniques, carefully crafted blades designed for specific purposes, scrapers for preparing hides, burins for engraving bone and antler, microliths, tiny stone blades that could be hafted together to make composite tools. This wasn't crude Stone Age technology. This was precision manufacturing, the result of tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. The bone and antler tools are even more impressive. Harpoons with multiple barbs, designed to embed themselves in large fish or marine mammals. Needles with eyes drilled through them for sewing tailored clothing. fish hooks, net weights, implements whose exact purpose we can only guess at. Most tellingly, many of these artifacts show evidence of extensive use and repair. A harpoon with a broken point that's been resharpened, a scraper that's been reworked so many times it's barely larger than a thumbnail, a bone needle that's been polished smooth by years of use. These weren't disposable tools. They were precious objects, carefully maintained and passed down through generations. Because in the late Paleolithic, everything had value, everything required effort to create. Nothing was wasted. The distribution of these finds tells us something too. They're scattered across what was once the entire expanse of Doggerland, from the western hills to the eastern plains, from the northern reaches near Denmark to the southern connections with continental Europe. This confirms what we'd expect. Doggerland wasn't just a bridge people crossed on their way to somewhere else. It was home. A landscape that sustained human populations across its entire extent. And more than that, it was a highway, a corridor of human movement connecting populations that would eventually diverge into distinct cultures. The people living in what would become Britain weren't isolated island dwellers. They were part of a continuous population stretching across northern Europe. They shared technologies, traded raw materials, exchanged partners, and maintained cultural connections across hundreds of miles. We know this because the artifacts from different regions show remarkable similarities. A harpoon design that appears in finds from both ends of Doggerland. Stone tool techniques that spread rapidly across the entire region. This is the signature of connected populations, groups in regular communication, sharing innovations and maintaining a common cultural identity. But they were also adapting to local conditions. Artifacts from the coastal areas show evidence of marine exploitation, fishing, and possibly seal hunting. Finds from inland river valleys emphasize hunting technology for large terrestrial game. Groups living in the forested western regions developed different toolkits than those living on the open eastern plains. This is exactly what you'd expect from human populations. We're adaptable, we specialize. But we also maintain connections with other groups, because isolation is death. The seasonal patterns of movement are harder to reconstruct, but archaeological evidence gives us clues. Concentrations of artifacts at particular locations suggest repeatedly used campsites. The types of tools found at different sites tell us about seasonal activities. Summer camps near good hunting grounds with lots of processing tools for dealing with large quantities of meat. Winter camps in protected valleys with evidence of hide working and tool manufacture. The indoor activities that filled the long dark months. Some sites show evidence of more permanent occupation, hearths that were used repeatedly over many seasons, accumulations of debris suggesting people returned to the same locations year after year. These might have been strategic spots, confluences of rivers, or particularly good fishing locations, places valuable enough that groups claim them as traditional territories. But mostly life was mobile, following the herds as they moved between seasonal grazing areas, tracking the salmon runs up rivers, moving to coastal areas when waterfowl were migrating. These people were nomadic, but their nomadism was structured, predictable, based on deep knowledge of landscape and seasons, and they were successful. For at least 6,000 years, probably longer, human populations thrived in Doggerland. They grew, they spread, they developed increasingly sophisticated technologies and social systems. They weren't just surviving, they were flourishing in a landscape that provided everything they needed. But the landscape was changing, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but inevitably. The ice was still melting, and all that meltwater had to go somewhere. By 10,000 BCE, Doggerland had become something extraordinary. Not just habitable, not just survivable, but genuinely prosperous. A landscape so rich in resources, so abundant in life that it had transformed from a windswept tundra into what might have been the most desirable real estate in all of prehistoric Europe. This was Doggerland's golden age. The ice sheets were in full retreat. Every year they pulled back further north, releasing water that carved new rivers, filled new lakes, created new wetlands. The land beneath, compressed under ice for thousands of years, was slowly rebounding, rising up like bread dough after the pressure is released. Geologists call this isostatic rebound, and in Doggerland it was creating something like paradise. The climate had warmed enough that winters were no longer the desperate survival challenges they'd been during the glacial maximum. Summers were long and productive. Growing seasons stretched for months, and the land responded with an explosion of life that must have seemed miraculous to the people living through it. Let's start with the megafauna, because they were everywhere. Woolly mammoths still roamed the northern reaches of Doggerland, though their populations were declining as the tundra gave way to forests. These weren't the massive Ice Age behemoths you might picture. By this period, they'd actually shrunk somewhat, adapting to changing conditions. But they were still enormous, still dangerous, still incredibly valuable to the humans who hunted them. A single mammoth provided enough meat to feed a band of 30 people for weeks, plus ivory for tools, hide for shelter, bones for construction. Taking down a mammoth required planning, coordination, courage. It was the ultimate test of a hunting group's skill and cohesion. But mammoths weren't the only giants. Woolly rhinoceroses, nearly as massive and far more aggressive, grazed in small herds across the grasslands. These were solitary, temperamental animals that could kill a human with one charge. Hunting them was suicide. Scavenging from them when they died naturally was opportunity. Finding a dead woolly rhino was like winning the prehistoric lottery. Then there were the giant elk, called Irish elk, though they ranged far beyond Ireland. Picture a creature the size of a modern moose, but with antlers spanning 12 feet across. 12 feet. These animals were walking architecture, their antlers so massive they had to choose their paths carefully through forests, avoiding dense growth that would trap those enormous racks. During autumn rut, males would battle each other with those antlers, creating sounds that echoed for miles, crashing, splintering impacts that would have been terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. Aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle, moved in larger herds. These weren't the docile farm animals we know today. Aurochs stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder, had horns that could gore a wolf, and temperaments to match. They were dangerous, but they were also incredibly abundant, and they provided reliable hunting targets for groups skilled enough to take them down. Wild horses ran alongside the aurochs, smaller and stockier than modern horses, but fast and nervous, requiring different hunting strategies, different approaches. Predators stalked all these herbivores. Lions, not the African variety, but a distinct European subspecies, hunted in prides across the open grasslands. Hyenas, larger and more robust than their modern counterparts, competed with human hunters for kills and scavenging opportunities. Wolves, already beginning the long process of domestication that would eventually produce dogs, prowled the edges of human settlements drawn by scraps and waste. But here's what made Doggerland truly special. It wasn't just the land-based resources, it was the water. Doggerland was surrounded by some of the richest marine environments on Earth. The North Sea, the English Channel, the Baltic approaches, all were teeming with fish populations that seem almost impossible by modern standards. This was before millennia of human exploitation had depleted the stocks. The waters were so thick with fish that, according to some reconstructions based on archaeological evidence, you could practically walk across their backs during spawning runs. Herring migrations filled the shallow waters seasonally, turning the sea silver with their numbers. Cod, massive specimens that would dwarf anything caught commercially today, prowled the deeper channels. Salmon ran up the rivers in such abundance that bears, human hunters, and birds of prey would all gather at the same fishing spots, temporary truces declared by the sheer abundance of food. Seals hauled out on beaches and sandbars in enormous colonies. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, breeding and nursing their pups in the relative safety of Doggerland shores. They provided meat, oil for lamps, waterproof skins for clothing and boats. A successful seal hunt could provision a community for an entire winter. And then there were the whales. The waters around Doggerland served as migration corridors for multiple whale species. Grey whales, right whales, even occasional orcas would pass through these channels during their seasonal movements. When a whale beached itself, died naturally, or could be driven into shallows by clever hunters, it represented an almost incomprehensible windfall of resources. Meat by the ton, oil, bone, baleen. A single whale could support dozens of people for months. Some researchers think Doggerland's coastal communities might have been among the world's first whale-hunting cultures. The evidence is fragmentary, mostly harpoon points and bone processing sites, but it suggests systematic maritime hunting rather than just opportunistic scavenging. These weren't people who waited for the ocean to provide. These were people who went out and took what they needed, even from the largest animals on Earth. The bird life was equally spectacular. Doggerland sat right in the middle of what is now called the East Atlantic Flyway, one of the world's major bird migration routes. Every spring and autumn, millions of birds would funnel through this landscape, stopping to rest and feed before continuing their journeys. Geese, ducks, swans, waders, raptors. The sky would have been dark with them during peak migration seasons. The noise must have been extraordinary, a constant cacophony of calls and wing beats. For human populations, these migrations represented predictable seasonal abundance. You didn't have to search for food during migration periods. You just had to stand in the right place and wait for dinner to literally fall from the sky. Archaeological sites from this period show enormous quantities of bird bones, evidence of systematic exploitation of these seasonal resources. People weren't just eating the birds. They were preserving them, smoking the meat, rendering the fat, using the feathers for insulation and decoration. This abundance was transforming how people lived. For most of human history, our ancestors had been nomadic, following herds, tracking seasonal resources, moving constantly because staying in one place meant depleting local food supplies. But in Doggerland during this golden age, resources were so abundant and so reliable that movement became optional rather than necessary. The first semi-permanent settlements began appearing. Not villages in the sense we'd recognise, but seasonal camps that were occupied year after year, gradually accumulating more substantial structures, more invested infrastructure. Why build a fishing weir that takes weeks to construct if you're just going to abandon it? Why develop sophisticated food storage techniques if you're moving every season? The answer is you don't. But if you know you'll be back, if you know this particular river mouth or coastal lagoon will provide reliably year after year, then suddenly investment makes sense. Structures became more substantial. Simple windbreaks gave way to more elaborate constructions. Post holes found at archaeological sites suggest wooden frameworks, possibly covered with hides or thatch. Hearths show evidence of being rebuilt and reused over multiple seasons. Storage pits lined with bark or hide to keep contents dry appear in greater numbers. Technological innovation accelerated in response to all this abundance. You can't efficiently exploit marine resources with tools designed for hunting land mammals. So people adapted, innovated, experimented. Fishing technology became increasingly sophisticated. Simple bone hooks gave way to composite hooks with specialized shapes for different species. Gorges, sharp bone slivers that would lodge in a fish's throat when swallowed, allowed catching fish without traditional hooks. Nets, woven from plant fibres, could harvest entire schools at once. Weirs and traps, constructed in rivers and coastal shallows, worked even when no one was actively tending them. Passive fishing systems that generated food around the clock. Boats evolved from simple log rafts into more sophisticated watercraft. We don't have actual boat remains from this period in Doggerland. Everything's underwater and degraded, but we can infer their existence from other evidence. Island sites that could only be reached by water. Deep-water fish species in archaeological middens. Distribution patterns of stone tools that clearly moved by sea rather than land. These people were maritime specialists, as comfortable on water as on land. They developed specialized weapons for different prey. Light-throwing spears with detachable points for birds, heavy thrusting spears with broad blades for large game, harpoons with toggling heads for marine mammals, designed to penetrate and then rotate, embedding themselves so the prey couldn't escape. Each weapon type represents accumulated generations of experimental knowledge, countless failed hunts, and incremental improvements. Shelter construction advanced beyond simple protection, from elements to specialized structures for different purposes. Archaeological evidence from comparable sites suggests they had dwelling structures, storage structures, working areas for processing hides or making tools, possibly even specialized structures for smoking fish or meat. This is spatial organization, architecture in its earliest form. As settlements grew more permanent and populations increased, something else began emerging. Trade networks. Doggerland wasn't uniform. The northern reaches closer to the retreating ice still had different resources than the southern areas bordering what would become the English Channel. The western edges, where Doggerland met what would become Britain, had different stone sources than the eastern edges facing the continent. Marine resources were abundant everywhere, but specific species were more common in some areas than others. These geographical variations created opportunities for exchange. Groups living near high-quality flint sources could trade that flint for amber from the Baltic region. Coastal communities could trade preserved fish and seal oil for furs and worked leather from inland hunting groups. Ochre, used for pigment, came from specific geological deposits and moved across hundreds of miles through trading networks. Archaeological evidence shows stone tools made from material that originated hundreds of miles away. This isn't random movement. This is systematic exchange, repeated transactions, maintained relationships between communities that might only meet once or twice per year, but who relied on each other for access to resources they couldn't obtain locally. Some researchers think certain locations in Doggerland might have functioned as trading centres, places where multiple communities would gather seasonally, not just to exchange goods, but to arrange marriages, share information, settle disputes. These gatherings would have been social events, opportunities to maintain the networks that bound scattered communities together. Population was growing. Not explosively, this was still the Stone Age, but steadily, each generation slightly larger than the last. Archaeologists estimate that at its peak, Doggerland might have supported several thousand people, maybe tens of thousands spread across its entire extent. These weren't concentrated populations. They were still scattered in small groups, but those groups were more numerous, more connected, more sedentary than their ancestors had been. The landscape itself was transforming. As temperatures continued warming, the grasslands and parkland that had dominated early Doggerland were giving way to forests. Oak trees, lime trees, hazel, spreading across the lowlands, creating dense woodlands. These forests changed everything. New plant resources, new animals, new challenges for hunting and movement. But they also created new opportunities. Hazelnuts, enormously abundant and nutritious, became a staple food. Archaeological sites from this period are littered with hazelnut shells, evidence of systematic collection and processing. Acorns, after labour-intensive processing to remove toxic tannins, provided another reliable plant food source. Wild boar, perfectly adapted to forest life, became increasingly important prey animals as the open land species declined. Wetlands expanded as rivers meandered across the flat landscape, creating marshes and fens. These wetlands were incredibly productive environments, supporting dense populations of waterfowl, providing reeds for construction, offering rich fishing grounds. Communities living along wetland edges had access to resources from forest, open grassland, and aquatic environments all within a few hours' walk. This was diversity, ecological richness that provided buffer against failure. If the salmon run was poor one year, there were still seals. If hunting was difficult, there were hazelnuts and birds. If coastal resources became depleted, you could move inland temporarily without starving. This resilience was what made Doggerland's golden age possible. Life wasn't perfect. People still died young by modern standards. Injuries were common, infections could be fatal. Winters were still hard, even if not as desperately hard as during the Ice Age. But for several thousand years, Doggerland provided something rare in human history: abundance. Enough food, enough resources, enough reliability that people could do more than just survive. They could thrive, innovate, build, plan for futures beyond the next meal or the next season. They didn't know they were living on borrowed time, couldn't know that the very warming that had made their world so rich was also ensuring its eventual destruction. The ice was still melting far to the north, and all that meltwater had to go somewhere. It was coming, slowly at first, then faster, then catastrophically. But for now, in this golden moment around 10,000 BCE, Doggerland was paradise, and the people living there were making the most of it. For 5,000 years, Doggerland had been paradise. Not perfect, not easy, but stable, predictable. Your ancestors had lived here for 200 generations. They'd learned every river, every hunting ground, every safe crossing point. They'd built networks of kinship and trade that stretched from what would become England to Denmark. They'd buried their dead in sacred places, told stories about the land's creation, developed entire cosmologies based on the permanence of their world. Then, around 8,500 BCE, everything started to change. The first signs were subtle, so subtle that nobody would have noticed within a single lifetime. Maybe the spring floods lasted a little longer. Maybe that low-lying campsite near the river mouth that your great-grandfather used every autumn was now underwater during high tide. Maybe the freshwater spring your family had used for generations started tasting slightly brackish during certain times of the year. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that screamed catastrophe. Just small changes, easily dismissed, easily adapted to. But here's the thing about slow catastrophes. They're almost worse than fast ones. A tsunami kills you quickly. You never see it coming, and then it's over. But slow disasters, they give you time to understand exactly what's happening. Time to realize you're powerless to stop it. Time to watch your entire world dissolve, generation by generation, knowing your children will have less than you had, and their children less still. The ice sheets were melting. Not in Doggerland, you couldn't see them from here. But thousands of miles to the north, the massive glaciers that had locked up so much of the world's water for 100,000 years were finally releasing their grip. The world was warming, and the seas were rising. About 3 centimetres per year, that's all. The width of your thumb. You could live your entire life in Doggerland during this period and never consciously notice the change. But multiply that thumb width by 50 years, and suddenly you've lost 1.5 meters of coastline. Multiply it by 100 years, and entire valleys have become bays. Multiply it by 1,000 years, and the world is unrecognizable. That's what your ancestors faced. A catastrophe in slow motion, an apocalypse by millimeters. The archaeological record from this period tells a strange and haunting story. We find settlement sites occupied for generations, then suddenly abandoned. Not violently, not catastrophically. The people just packed up and left, taking everything movable with them. Then, a few hundred meters inland, we find another settlement. Same tool types, same pottery styles, same people. They'd simply moved. Then that site gets abandoned too. And another one appears further inland. It's like watching a tide come in, but the tide takes centuries instead of hours. And instead of water covering sand, it's covering hunting grounds, burial sites, sacred places, entire landscapes full of meaning and memory. Picture yourself in one of these communities around 8,200 BCE. You're maybe 30 years old, which makes you one of the elders. You've lived here your whole life, as did your parents and their parents before them. Your family's burial ground is down by the river mouth, where the oldest ancestors lie beneath stone markers that have been there longer than anyone can remember. But the river mouth isn't where it used to be. Every year it seems to push a little further inland. That burial ground you visited as a child. Now it floods during spring tides. The stone markers are still there, visible at low tide but covered with seaweed and barnacles. Soon they'll be permanently underwater. Your children ask you why the sea is angry. You don't have an answer. Your grandparents never mentioned anything like this. The stories passed down through generations talk about the land as eternal, unchanging. But you can see with your own eyes that it's not, so you make a decision. You move the settlement. It's not easy. This isn't just about building new shelters. You have to convince the entire community to abandon the place where their ancestors are buried, where their sacred sites are located, where every tree and rock and stream carries memories and meaning. Some refuse, mostly the old ones, who say they'd rather die in the place they know than live in some new location inland. Some of them do die, staying behind in isolated shelters near the old sites, waiting for the waters to recede. The waters never recede, but most people move, because they have children, and children need futures, so you pack up everything portable and trek inland, maybe 5 kilometers, maybe 10. You find a new location on higher ground. You build new shelters. You learn new hunting routes. You create new sacred sites. And you tell your children stories about the old places, the drowned places, making them mythical in memory, even as they disappear beneath the waves. This pattern repeated across Doggerland for nearly 3,000 years. Generation after generation watching their world shrink. And here's what makes it even more psychologically devastating. There was no way to understand what was happening. No scientific framework to explain that ice sheets in Scandinavia were melting, raising global sea levels. No way to predict how far the waters would rise or when they'd stop. For all your ancestors knew, the entire world might keep flooding forever. Maybe this was the end of everything. Maybe the gods were angry. Maybe some cosmic balance had been disturbed, but they adapted. Because humans are really, really good at adapting. The rising waters weren't just a challenge, they were also an opportunity. As the seas rose, Doggerland was transforming from a solid land mass into an increasingly complex archipelago. Rivers that had been freshwater streams were becoming tidal estuaries. Inland areas that had been dry were becoming marshlands. And all these new water environments were creating new ecological niches, new resources to exploit. Your ancestors became amphibious, not literally but culturally. They'd always known how to fish in rivers, but now they had to learn ocean fishing. They'd always built simple rafts for crossing streams, but now they needed real boats capable of navigating tidal waters and open sea. Archaeological evidence shows this transition clearly. Early Doggerland sites show almost no marine resources. Everything's terrestrial: deer, aurochs, wild boar, nuts, berries. But sites from 8000 BCE onwards show increasing amounts of fish bones, seal remains, seabird bones, shellfish. The diet was changing. The lifestyle was changing. Tool technologies evolved too. We start finding specialized fishing equipment: bonefish hooks, net weights, harpoon points designed for marine hunting. We find evidence of boats, or at least boat building, woodworking tools, waterproof resins made from tree pitch, carved wooden artifacts that only make sense if you're building watercraft. Most remarkably, we start finding evidence of semi-aquatic settlements: pile dwellings built out over the water, fish weirs and traps built to exploit tidal movements, shell middens marking places where communities processed huge quantities of shellfish. These people weren't just adapting, they were innovating. They were developing an entirely new way of life, one suited to an environment that was half land, half water, and constantly changing between the two. But the adaptation came at a cost. The rising waters weren't just covering land, they were transforming ecosystems entirely. Those freshwater rivers full of salmon and pike. As the seas rose, salt water pushed further upstream, making them brackish estuaries. The salmon adapted or moved. The pike, which can't tolerate salt water, disappeared from many areas entirely. The lush river valleys where deer and aurochs grazed. As sea levels rose, these became tidal flats, muddy and unstable, flooded twice daily. The large game animals moved inland, following the grasslands to higher ground. Hunters had to travel further for the same prey. The dense forests of oak and hazel that had provided nuts, firewood, and shelter. In low-lying areas, these were being replaced by salt marshes, dominated by tough grasses and reeds. Useful in their own way, but requiring entirely different knowledge to exploit. Your ancestors were living through an ecological revolution. The old rules didn't apply anymore. The knowledge passed down from grandparents about where to hunt, when to gather, which plants were safe to eat, all of it was becoming obsolete as the landscape transformed. This created a generational divide that must have been psychologically wrenching. The elderly, repositories of traditional knowledge, were watching their expertise become irrelevant. The young, forced to innovate and experiment, were developing skills and knowledge their parents and grandparents couldn't teach them. Imagine being 60 years old, a respected elder, and having your grandchildren explain to you how to set a fish trap in tidal waters. Your entire life, you've been the teacher, the source of wisdom. Now you're the student, learning skills that didn't exist when you were young. Learning to survive in a world you no longer recognize. But perhaps the most profound change was happening at a community level. As Doggerland fragmented into islands, populations that had been connected for thousands of years were being separated by rising waters. That neighbouring group you traded with every summer, now there's a tidal channel between your territories. You can still visit, but you need boats, and the journey is dangerous. The genetic evidence from this period shows something fascinating. Before the flooding, Doggerland populations show high genetic diversity and evidence of widespread interbreeding between groups. People are moving around, marrying into distant communities, maintaining genetic connections across hundreds of kilometres. But as the waters rose, this genetic mixing becomes more restricted. Island populations become more isolated, more genetically distinct. Trade continues. We can see that from shared artifact styles. But the intimate genetic mixing that comes from regular intermarriage starts breaking down. Communities were becoming islands, literally and metaphorically, and yet they survived. For 3,000 years, from roughly 8,500 BCE to 5,500 BCE, the people of Doggerland adapted to their shrinking world. They moved their settlements inland, they developed marine subsistence strategies, they built better boats, they maintained trading networks despite increasing isolation, they told new stories to make sense of their changing world. They did everything right. They were smart, adaptive, innovative, resilient. They were survivors in every sense of the word. But around 6,200 BCE, something happened that no amount of adaptation could prepare them for. Something that made the slow rise of the seas look gentle by comparison. The ground shook, and the sea rose not in millimeters, but in meters, not over years, but in minutes. The Storegga slide was coming. But Doggerland's fate wouldn't be decided by the slow, predictable rise of the seas alone. Sometimes history turns on a single moment, a geological accident, a catastrophe so sudden and overwhelming that it reshapes everything in minutes. For Doggerland, that moment came around 6,200 BCE. The day probably started like any other. People waking in their settlements along the coast, children playing near the shore, fishermen preparing their boats, families going about the daily routine of survival that had sustained them for thousands of years. The sun rose over a landscape that had already changed dramatically. The Great Plains were shrinking. The rivers were widening. Every generation watched the sea claim more of their world. But life continued. People adapted. They moved when they had to, rebuilt when the floods came, adjusted their territories and their trade routes to match the new geography. They had no idea what was coming. 350 miles to the north, off the coast of what is now Norway, the continental shelf had been under tremendous pressure for centuries. Think about what happens during an ice age. Massive glaciers, some over a mile thick, press down on the land with unimaginable weight. The Earth's crust actually deforms under this pressure, sinking deeper into the mantle below. When the ice melts, that pressure releases. The land begins to rebound, rising back toward its original position. But this rebound doesn't happen smoothly. It creates instability. The edge of the continental shelf, where underwater cliffs drop from shallow coastal waters into the deep ocean, becomes particularly vulnerable. For thousands of years after the ice sheets retreated, the Norwegian continental shelf had been slowly destabilizing. Sediments that had accumulated during the glacial period, layer upon layer of sand, silt and clay deposited over tens of thousands of years, were stacked precariously on slopes that were steepening as the land rebounded. These sediments were saturated with water, held together by nothing more than friction and the weak chemical bonds between clay particles. The entire structure was unstable, a geological disaster waiting to happen. Then something triggered it. Maybe an earthquake, maybe just the accumulated weight reaching a critical threshold. Maybe methane hydrates trapped in the sediments began to destabilize, creating pockets of gas that weakened the structure. We don't know exactly what the trigger was, but we know what happened next. The Storegga slide, one of the largest submarine landslides in Earth's recent history. 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment, an area roughly the size of Scotland, suddenly lost cohesion and collapsed. Not all at once, but in a series of catastrophic failures that probably lasted several hours. Imagine a cliff face the height of a skyscraper and hundreds of miles long, suddenly liquefying and sliding down into the abyss. The sediment didn't just fall, it flowed, moving like a dense avalanche underwater, racing down the continental slope at speeds that might have reached 50 miles per hour. The displacement of water was instantaneous and massive. When you suddenly move that much material fast underwater, the ocean doesn't have time to flow around it. It gets pushed, violently. The water surface above the slide area deformed, creating waves that radiated outward in all directions at the speed of a jet aircraft. Not ordinary waves, not even storm waves, tsunami waves. In the deep ocean, tsunami waves are barely noticeable, travelling as broad, fast-moving swells that ships can pass over without even realising what's beneath them. But when these waves reach shallow water, everything changes. The front of the wave slows down as it drags against the ocean floor. The back of the wave, still moving at full speed in deeper water, catches up. The wave compresses, rising higher and higher as all the energy concentrates into a smaller and smaller space. By the time the Storegga tsunami reached Doggerland, the waves were colossal. Modern computer simulations based on the geological evidence suggest wave heights of 20 to 25 meters. That's 65 to 80 feet. A wall of water as tall as an 8-story building, moving at the speed of a running horse. The people of Doggerland had no warning system, no seismographs to detect the initial slide, no communication network to spread the alarm, no understanding of tsunamis or how they behaved. They might have noticed the sea behaving strangely. Tsunami waves are often preceded by a dramatic withdrawal of water, as the trough of the wave arrives first. Coastal areas that had been underwater suddenly exposed, fish flopping on wet sand, boats grounded hundreds of feet from the normal shoreline. Some people probably walked out onto the exposed seafloor, curious about this strange phenomenon, collecting the fish, examining the suddenly visible underwater landscape. They had maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15. Then the horizon changed. A white line appeared in the distance, growing taller and louder as it approached. The roar of billions of tons of water in motion, a sound like continuous thunder, would have been audible for miles. There was nowhere to run. Doggerland was flat. Most of the inhabited areas were barely above sea level even in normal conditions. The low hills and ridges that dotted the landscape weren't high enough or far enough away. When the wave hit, it didn't break like a normal wave. It just kept coming, a surge of water that swept inland for miles, carrying everything with it. Settlements vanished in seconds. Wooden structures, carefully built and maintained for generations, were torn apart and scattered. Boats were ripped from their moorings and hurled inland. People were swept away. Those caught in the open drowned in minutes. Those in more protected locations might have had time to realize what was happening before the water reached them. The archaeological evidence suggests that entire communities along Doggerland's northern coast ceased to exist in a single afternoon. But a tsunami isn't just one wave. The Storegga event probably generated a series of waves over several hours. After the first surge swept inland, the water would have pulled back, draining toward the sea in a massive undertow that would have been almost as destructive as the initial impact. Then another wave would arrive, and another, each one reconfiguring the landscape, moving sediment, destroying anything that had survived the previous surge. We know this happened because we can see the evidence in sediment cores taken from the seafloor and from coastal areas that were once part of Doggerland. There's a distinctive layer, usually between 5 and 50 centimeters thick, that appears in cores dated to around 6,200 BCE. This layer is completely different from the sediments above and below it. It's a chaotic mixture of sand, shells, and organic material, all jumbled together. There are marine organisms mixed with terrestrial plant remains. There are sediments from deep water mixed with sediments from shallow coastal areas. This is the signature of a tsunami deposit, a geological record of catastrophe, preserved in mud for 8,000 years. The layer appears in cores from the Shetland Islands, from the Norwegian coast, from what is now the North Sea floor, and from coastal areas of Britain. It's even been found in Scotland, miles inland from the present coastline, proof that the tsunami penetrated far beyond what we think of as coastal areas. Each location shows the same chaotic mixing, the same abrupt disruption of normal sedimentation, all dating to the same brief window of time around 6,200 BCE. But the Storegga tsunami didn't just kill people and destroy settlements. It fundamentally altered Doggerland's geography in ways that accelerated its final submersion. The wave scoured channels through the low ridges and marshlands that had helped protect interior regions from the advancing sea. It deposited massive amounts of sediment in some areas while eroding others away entirely. It changed drainage patterns, altered river courses, and breached natural barriers that had been holding back the ocean. Think of Doggerland before Storegga as a landscape barely holding on, a network of islands and peninsulas connected by marshlands and tidal flats, with the sea advancing slowly but relentlessly. The tsunami was like taking a hammer to a crumbling dam. It didn't destroy Doggerland outright, but it broke the structures, natural and human, that had been allowing people to persist there despite the rising seas. After Storegga, the pace of change accelerated. Areas that had been habitable became permanently flooded within decades. Islands that had supported communities for centuries were cut off completely, their populations either evacuated or left to die out in isolation. The complex network of seasonal camps and permanent settlements that had characterized Doggerland's golden age fragmented and collapsed. The survivors faced impossible choices. Some probably tried to rebuild in their traditional territories, only to watch them disappear beneath the waves within their own lifetimes. Others migrated, carrying what they could to the higher ground of Britain, or back to the continental mainland. These weren't organised migrations. There was no master plan, no political coordination. Just families and small groups making desperate decisions about where they could survive. The genetic and archaeological evidence suggests these migrations weren't one-time events either. People moved back and forth as conditions changed, as some areas became uninhabitable, while others remained viable for a few more generations. The cultural traditions developed in Doggerland didn't simply vanish. They fragmented, adapted, and were absorbed into the evolving cultures of Britain and the continent. But something essential was lost. The unity of experience that had characterized Doggerland's population, the shared landscape and shared resources that had connected communities across hundreds of miles, all of that dissolved. The survivors were scattered to different lands with different conditions, and their cultures began diverging in ways that would have been unimaginable before the tsunami. Some researchers think the Storegga tsunami might be preserved in the oral traditions of northern European peoples. Could the flood myths that appear in Norse mythology and in the traditions of Scottish and Irish coastal communities be distant echoes of this event? It's impossible to prove, but not impossible to imagine. Stories of a great wave that drowned a land, of entire peoples displaced in a single day, of a world that existed before the seas divided the lands. These narratives appear repeatedly in the folklore of peoples whose ancestors lived around the North Sea. If oral traditions can preserve the memory of events for thousands of years, and there's growing evidence that they can, then the Storegga tsunami would be exactly the kind of catastrophe that would be remembered, dramatic enough to imprint itself on the cultural memory of survivors, significant enough to mark a clear before and after in people's understanding of their history, traumatic enough to be told and retold across generations until it transformed from history into myth. But whether or not it was remembered in folklore, the Storegga tsunami absolutely was a turning point for Doggerland. It was the beginning of the end, the event that transformed a slow decline into an inevitable collapse. After Storegga, it was only a matter of time before the last dry land disappeared beneath the waves. The only question was how long the final remnants would hold on, and what would happen to the people who clung to them until the very end. The tsunami had done its work. Doggerland's heart was shattered, its central lowlands transformed into a shallow inland sea studded with dying islands. But the land itself wasn't finished yet. What remained would take another 700 years to finally disappear beneath the waves. 700 years of slow, agonizing retreat. 700 years of communities watching their world shrink. Generation by generation, until finally, around 5500 BCE, the last connection between Britain and Europe vanished forever. This is the story of those final centuries, the story of the people who refused to leave, who clung to their ancestral lands even as the waters rose around them, and the story of how their isolation would shape the course of British history for the next 7,500 years. Let's start with what was left after the Storegga tsunami receded. Picture yourself standing on one of the surviving high points around 6,200 BCE, maybe 50 years after the wave hit. You're looking out across a landscape that has been utterly transformed. Where once there were rolling hills and river valleys, you now see water. Everywhere, water. Shallow seas, tidal marshes, lagoons that appear and disappear with the moon's phases, but it's not entirely submerged, not yet. Rising from this watery maze are islands, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, ranging in size from substantial hills that might support a few dozen families, down to temporary sandbanks that vanish at high tide. These are the remnants, the highest points of what was once a continuous landscape. And on these islands, clinging to existence with remarkable tenacity, are the survivors. They weren't the same people who had lived in Doggerland's golden age. Those communities were gone, destroyed by the tsunami, or scattered to Britain and the continent. These were their children, their grandchildren, people born into a world already dying, who knew only through stories what their homeland had once been. And they were adapting. They had to. The economy of the islands was nothing like what had existed before. No more large game hunting across open grasslands. No more seasonal migrations following herds. The megafauna were gone, either drowned in the tsunami or fled to more stable lands. What remained was a different kind of abundance, more precarious but still rich enough to support human life. Fish, birds, shellfish. These final Doggerlanders became masters of the waterways. They built boats, not the simple dugout canoes their ancestors had used for river crossings, but sophisticated watercraft capable of navigating tidal channels and crossing the increasingly wide gaps between islands. Archaeological evidence from similar coastal environments suggests they probably used skin boats, wooden frames covered with seal or auroch hides, waterproofed with animal fat, light enough to carry, sturdy enough to handle rough seas. They learned to read the tides like you read a clock. They had to. Missing the tide could mean being stranded on a sandbank when the waters rose, or worse, being caught in the fierce tidal currents that scoured the channels between islands. They developed an intimate knowledge of every submerged sandbar, every shifting channel, every seasonal variation in water levels. This knowledge was power, survival itself, and it was passed down through songs, stories, and direct observation. Their settlements were temporary by necessity. You couldn't build permanent structures on land that might be underwater next season. Instead, they created seasonal camps on the most reliable high points, probably moving between several locations throughout the year to exploit different resources as they became available. Spring might mean one island where migratory birds nested by the thousands, their eggs providing easy protein. Summer could mean another location with good fishing in the tidal pools. Autumn might require moving to yet another spot where salmon ran up the few remaining freshwater streams. But with each generation, the options grew fewer. The sea was still rising, more slowly than during the catastrophic post-Ice Age melt, but relentlessly. A few inches per decade doesn't sound like much, but over generations it adds up. Islands that had supported families for decades became seasonal camps, then just stopover points at low tide, then submerged entirely. Each lost island meant fewer resources, more competition for what remained. The genetic evidence from later British populations suggests something remarkable happened during this period. The island communities didn't just sit passively waiting to drown. They were making choices, hard ones, about who would stay and who would leave. Probably the pattern was something like this. Each generation, the young people faced a decision: stay on the shrinking islands with their families, or take their chances crossing to Britain or the continent, where land was stable but already occupied by established communities. Some stayed. These were the true diehards, the ones who couldn't imagine leaving their ancestral lands, who believed somehow the waters would stop rising, that their islands would survive. Others left, and here's where it gets really interesting for understanding British history. The ones who left for Britain weren't just carrying their possessions. They were carrying their culture, their stories, their technological adaptations to coastal living, and most importantly their genetic heritage. By 5700 BCE, about 500 years after the tsunami, the situation was becoming critical. What had been hundreds of islands was now down to perhaps a few dozen substantial pieces of land, plus countless temporary sandbanks and tidal marshes. The largest of these, the one we now call Dogger Bank, was probably the last major refuge. Rising about 45 feet above the surrounding seabed, it would have remained above water longer than anywhere else. Imagine being part of that final community. You're living on an island that your great-grandparents remembered as part of a vast landscape. Now it's maybe 10 miles across at low tide, half that at high tide. You can see Britain to the west on clear days, a dark line on the horizon, tantalizingly close but separated by channels too wide and dangerous to cross easily. To the east is the continent, equally visible, equally unreachable for all practical purposes. You're not starving. The waters around your island are incredibly rich, and you've become expert at exploiting them. But you're isolated, cut off. Marriages have to be arranged within your small community, which can't be more than a few hundred people at most. Everyone is related to everyone else. The gene pool is shrinking along with the land, and every generation the water gets higher. Landmarks your parents showed. You're gone. The small islands where you used to gather birds' eggs are now just ripples visible at the lowest spring tides. The beach where you played as a child is underwater. You're watching your entire world disappear in slow motion. Then came the final severance. We can't pinpoint the exact year, but sometime around 5500 BCE, the last land connection between Britain and continental Europe finally vanished beneath the waves. This wasn't dramatic like the Storegga tsunami. No single wave that destroyed everything in hours. Instead, it was probably just another winter storm, maybe a particularly high spring tide, and someone realized that the sandbar they'd used to cross to the next island at low tide, the one that had always been there, was gone. At that moment, Britain became an island. Not in geology, it had been geologically separate for a while, but in human experience. You could no longer walk to Europe. You couldn't follow the game trails that had connected your ancestors to the continent for hundreds of thousands of years. If you wanted to cross, you needed a boat, navigation skills, courage, and luck. This geographic isolation would shape everything that came after. While continental Europe would see wave after wave of migrations, new peoples bringing new cultures, new technologies, new genes, Britain became relatively isolated. Not completely. Trade and contact continued across the Channel and the North Sea, but reduced, filtered, slower. British culture began to diverge from continental patterns, developing its own distinctive character. The genetic evidence shows this clearly. British populations from this period forward show less diversity than their continental counterparts, a signature of island isolation. They also show something else. A surprisingly high proportion of ancestry from those final Doggerland refugees, the people who had clung to the drowning islands until the very end before finally accepting the inevitable and crossing to Britain. These last Doggerlanders brought with them something precious beyond measure. Not just genes or tools, but knowledge. They were maritime specialists who had spent generations learning to live in a waterlogged world. They understood boats, tides, navigation, coastal resources. When they integrated into British communities, they brought these skills with them. Some researchers think this is why Britain developed such a strong maritime culture so early compared to inland European regions. But they also brought something less tangible. Stories. Every culture has flood myths, tales of rising waters and lost lands. Many of them are metaphorical or refer to local events. But some British flood legends have details that are eerily specific. Tales of great lands to the east swallowed by the sea. Stories of ancestors who lived in a rich country where Britain, Denmark and the Netherlands are now separated by water. Could these be genuine memories, passed down through hundreds of generations? Probably not in any detailed sense. Oral traditions distort and change too much over millennia. But the emotional core, the memory of loss, the knowledge that the ancestors once lived in lands now underwater that might have persisted, transformed, mythologized, wrapped in supernatural explanations, but still carrying a kernel of truth about the drowned world. Meanwhile, the last remnants of Doggerland were finally succumbing. By 5000 BCE, even Doggerbank, that final refuge, was mostly submerged. What remained were just the highest points, small rocky outcrops barely breaking the surface at low tide, surrounded by treacherous shoals. Dangerous to shipping, useless to humans except as occasional rest stops for seabirds. The people were gone, fled to more stable lands, or perhaps the last few had perished, unable or unwilling to leave. The North Sea had claimed its prize, 18,000 square miles of inhabited landscape gone, thousands of years of human history erased, hundreds of settlement sites, burial grounds, tool workshops, all drowned beneath 60 to 120 feet of cold, dark water. It was one of the most complete archaeological disasters in human prehistory, an entire chapter of our story swallowed without trace, or so it seemed. For 7,500 years, Doggerland existed only in fishermen's tales of nets bringing up strange worked flints or mammoth bones from the sea floor. The scientific world knew nothing of it. British and European prehistory had a mysterious gap, an unexplained discontinuity between the Ice Age and the Neolithic. Where had the people gone when the glaciers retreated? How had Britain been populated? The answers lay beneath the waves, invisible, forgotten, but the land itself wasn't quite ready to give up its secrets. Doggerbank remained, 60 feet below the surface, a shallow spot where the North Sea is only half its usual depth. Fishermen learned to avoid it or exploit it depending on their needs. Trawlers crossing it would snag their nets on submerged obstacles. Storms would churn up the seafloor, occasionally bringing strange objects to the surface. And very slowly, over centuries, clues began accumulating. Not enough to piece together the full story, not yet, but hints, whispers of the drowned world, suggestions that British prehistory was more complex, more tragic, and more fascinating than anyone had imagined. The isolation of Britain was complete. The transformation from peninsula to island was finished, and the stage was set for everything that would follow, from the Neolithic Revolution to the Roman invasion to the Industrial Age. All of it shaped, in ways large and small, by the fact that Britain was an island, and it was an island because Doggerland had drowned. But the drowning wasn't the end of the story, it was just the end of the beginning. For thousands of years, Doggerland existed only in silence. No records, no memories, no stories passed down through generations. The people who walked its hills and fished its rivers were gone. The land itself was gone, buried beneath millions of tons of seawater. It was as if an entire world had been erased from history, wiped clean from human memory so thoroughly that no one even knew to look for it. Then, in the late 1800s, fishermen started pulling up ghosts. Picture this. You're a Victorian trawler captain working the waters east of England. It's brutal work, dangerous work. You're dragging heavy nets across the seafloor 100 feet down, hoping to catch cod and herring to sell at market. Most days you get fish. Some days you get nothing but torn nets and frustration. But occasionally, mixed in with the fish and mud, you find something else. Something that doesn't belong. A carved bone. A worked piece of flint. A fragment of antler with marks that are clearly man-made. At first, these finds were curiosities. Oddities that fishermen would keep on their mantles or sell to collectors. Nobody really understood what they were finding. The North Sea was just the North Sea. Had always been the North Sea. The idea that there might be a lost world down there, an entire drowned landscape with its own history and people, that seemed like fantasy. But the artifacts kept coming up. Year after year, decade after decade, trawlers were dredging up evidence of human habitation from what should have been empty seafloor. Stone tools, bone implements, fragments of worked wood, sometimes even pieces of what appeared to be human skull. The objects were clearly ancient, clearly prehistoric. But what were they doing out in the middle of the sea? A few scientists started asking questions. In the early 1900s, geologists noticed something interesting about the seafloor mapping being done for shipping lanes and submarine cables. The North Sea wasn't uniformly deep. There were patterns down there, features that looked suspiciously like river valleys and coastal plains, features that suggested this area had once been dry land. In 1913, a British geologist named Clement Reid published a paper with a revolutionary idea. What if the North Sea hadn't always been a sea? What if, during the Ice Ages when sea levels were lower, there had been a land bridge connecting Britain to continental Europe? He called this hypothetical land the Great Plain, and suggested it might explain all those mysterious artifacts the fishermen kept finding. Most of his colleagues thought he was speculating wildly. But Reid had noticed something crucial. The depth of the North Sea, the pattern of the seafloor, the distribution of those archaeological finds, they all told the same story. There had been land here, recently, in geological terms. Land that had been inhabited by humans before the ocean claimed it. For decades, Reid's ideas remained controversial. There just wasn't enough evidence. The technology didn't exist to properly survey the seafloor. The artifacts fishermen were bringing up were scattered and random, impossible to date precisely or connect to specific sites. The idea of Doggerland, the name archaeologists would eventually give to Reid's Great Plain, remained an intriguing hypothesis, but not proven fact. Then came 1931, and a discovery that changed everything. The trawler Calinda was fishing off the Norfolk coast, dragging her nets through an area known for good catches. When the crew hauled the nets in, they found the usual mass of struggling fish, but wedged in among them was something extraordinary. A piece of worked antler, about 8 inches long, clearly shaped by human hands into a barbed point. It was a harpoon, a weapon designed for hunting large fish or sea mammals, and it was 11,000 years old. The Kalinda Harpoon Point, as it became known, was a revelation. Here was definitive proof that humans had lived and hunted in what was now the North Sea. The dating was unambiguous. The craftsmanship was sophisticated. This wasn't some random artifact washed out from the coast. This was evidence of a thriving Mesolithic culture that had existed on dry land where there was now only ocean. Suddenly Doggerland wasn't speculation anymore. It was real. There really had been a lost world beneath the waves. But proving it existed and actually understanding what it looked like, those were very different challenges. For decades after the Kalinda discovery, Doggerland remained frustratingly mysterious. Fishermen kept pulling up artifacts, yes. Archaeologists could now date them and study them properly. But without being able to actually see the seafloor, without mapping it in detail, Doggerland remained a shadowland, real but invisible. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: oil companies. In the 1990s, petroleum exploration in the North Sea required incredibly detailed mapping of everything beneath the seafloor. Companies needed to know exactly where to drill, what geological formations lay where, what the underground structure looked like. They developed sophisticated seismic survey technology that could create three-dimensional images of the seafloor and everything below it. These surveys used sound waves. Ships would drag arrays of air guns and hydrophones, sending acoustic pulses down through the water and into the seafloor. The sound waves would bounce off different layers of rock and sediment, and sensitive microphones would record the returning echoes. Computers could then analyze millions of these echoes to build up precise images of the underwater landscape. The surveys were designed to look for oil reservoirs thousands of feet underground, but they also captured everything in between, including the surface topography of the seafloor itself, and what they revealed was breathtaking. Around 2007, a team of archaeologists led by Vince Gaffney at the University of Birmingham realized they could use this oil company data to map Doggerland. The petroleum companies had already done the expensive work of surveying massive areas of the North Sea floor. That data existed. It just needed to be analysed from an archaeological perspective instead of a geological one. When they processed the data, Doggerland came back to life. The seismic images showed river valleys cutting through what was now seafloor. They showed coastlines, ancient beaches now buried under mud and sand. They revealed lakes, marshlands, areas of higher ground that would have been hills. They found what appeared to be cliff faces where erosion had cut into softer sediments. The data was so detailed they could trace individual river channels, see where tributaries merged, identify what had probably been estuaries and lagoons. For the first time in 8,000 years, humans could see Doggerland's landscape, not with their eyes, but through computer reconstructions based on seismic data. And what they saw was stunning. Doggerland hadn't been some flat, featureless plain. It was a diverse landscape, almost as complex as Britain or Holland today. There were river systems as large as the Thames or Rhine, draining vast watersheds and creating fertile valleys. There were areas of higher ground that would have offered defensive positions and good views. There were wetlands and marshes teeming with waterfowl. There were what appeared to be ancient coastlines where Doggerland's residents would have collected shellfish and hunted seals. The researchers created 3D reconstructions showing what the land would have looked like at different time periods as sea levels gradually rose. They could track how the rivers changed course, how the coastlines shifted, how habitable areas shrank as the ocean advanced. It was like watching a time-lapse video of a landscape dying, except each frame represented decades or centuries. But seismic data can only tell you so much. It shows the shape of the land, the basic topography. What it can't show is the fine detail, the actual archaeological sites, the places where people lived and died. For that, you need to get down there, You need actual artifacts, actual excavation, and that's where things get really challenging. Underwater archaeology in the North Sea is brutally difficult. The water is cold, murky, and dangerous. Currents are strong and unpredictable. Visibility is often just a few feet at most. The sites are deep, sometimes over 100 feet down, requiring technical diving with complex gas mixtures and careful decompression. The weather is unpredictable. Storms can appear with little warning, making work impossible for days or weeks. Worse, the seafloor isn't stable. Sediments shift constantly. Sites that fishermen reported finding in the 1970s might be buried under 10 feet of sand now. Or they might have been scoured away by currents, destroyed before anyone could study them properly. It's like trying to excavate sites that are actively being erased even as you try to document them. Despite these challenges, marine archaeologists have been making incredible discoveries. In 2019, a team working off the coast of Holland found what appeared to be a Mesolithic settlement site. The seismic data had shown a slight mound, probably a rise in the landscape that would have been desirable for building. When divers investigated, they found worked flints, bone tools, and fragments of charcoal that could be radiocarbon dated. The site dated to about 9,000 years ago, right in the middle of Doggerland's final centuries. Analysis of the artifact suggested this had been a seasonal camp, probably used by hunter-gatherers who moved around the landscape following game and plant resources. The charcoal came from a hearth, meaning they had actual evidence of fires, of people sitting around cooking food and warming themselves on what was now the seafloor. Other sites have revealed even more. Fragments of basketry preserved in anaerobic mud. Bone fish hooks showing sophisticated fishing technology. Worked pieces of amber, suggesting either trade networks or that Doggerland's residents were crafting jewellery and decorative objects. These weren't just survivors eking out a desperate existence. These were people with culture, technology, and enough surplus time and resources to create beautiful objects. But here's what's really exciting archaeologists. They've only scratched the surface, literally. The seismic surveys have identified hundreds of potential archaeological sites across Doggerland's drowned landscape. Mounds that could be settlement sites, areas of unusual sediment that might contain preserved organic materials, features that look like they could be fish traps or defensive structures. Each of these sites represents a piece of Doggerland's story waiting to be uncovered. Each one could reveal something new about how people lived, what technologies they developed, how they adapted to the slowly rising waters. Some sites might contain burials, giving us actual DNA from Doggerland's residents. Others might preserve wooden structures showing us their building techniques. The potential discoveries are almost endless, but so are the challenges. Funding is limited. The work is expensive and dangerous, and time is running out. The North Sea is increasingly crowded with wind farms, oil platforms, shipping lanes, and fishing operations. Construction and industrial activity destroy archaeological sites regularly. Sites that survived 8,000 years under the sea are being damaged or destroyed by modern development before anyone can study them. This has created a race against time. Archaeologists are trying to survey and document as many sites as possible before they're gone forever. They're developing new technologies, remotely operated vehicles that can map sites without requiring human divers. They're using artificial intelligence to analyze seismic data more quickly, identifying potential sites that deserve closer investigation. They're also working with fishermen, building networks to report archaeological finds quickly so they can be studied before they're lost. That same practice that first revealed Doggerland, trawlers bringing up artifacts, is now part of a systematic effort to understand this lost world before the evidence disappears. And with each new discovery, with each artifact catalogued and each site mapped, Doggerland becomes more real. More than just data and reconstructions. A place where real people lived real lives, hunted and fished and raised families, built homes and told stories around fires. But perhaps the most important discovery isn't any single artifact or site. It's what Doggerland teaches us about the relationship between humans and environmental change. Here was a landscape that supported thriving human communities for thousands of years. Then climate changed, sea levels rose, and it vanished. The people who lived there had to adapt, migrate, or die. Sound familiar? Because that same process is happening right now, just faster. What took Doggerland's residents several thousand years to experience, we might see happen in a few centuries. Rising seas threatening coastal communities, climate zones shifting, landscapes that were habitable becoming uninhabitable. Doggerland isn't just ancient history, it's a preview, a warning, and a lesson in what happens when the world changes and humans have to change with it, or be swept away. The question is whether we're paying attention. So here we are. We've travelled from Doggerland's frozen birth through its golden age, watched it drown in stages over thousands of years, witnessed the Storegga wave erase what remained, and followed archaeologists as they pieced together fragments of a lost world from the seabed. Now comes the question that matters most. What does any of this mean for us? Why should you care about people who died 8,000 years ago in a land that no longer exists? Because Doggerland isn't just history, it's prophecy. Every single lesson that Doggerland has to teach us is playing out right now, in real time, on coastlines around the world. Rising seas, displaced populations, landscapes transforming faster than cultures can adapt. The difference is that Doggerland's people didn't know what was coming. They couldn't see the ice sheets melting in Scandinavia. They had no climate models, no satellite data, no international conferences to debate response strategies. They just lived their lives, generation after generation, until the world they knew ceased to exist. We don't have that excuse. We know exactly what's happening. We can measure it, model it, predict where and when the water will rise, and yet we're watching the same story unfold anyway, just on a faster timeline. Start with the most basic lesson. Land that seems permanent isn't. For 6,000 years, Doggerland was as real and solid as France or Germany is today. It had rivers you could name, hills you could recognize from miles away, valleys where your grandparents were buried. People knew that landscape like you know your neighborhood. Every tree, every stream, every good fishing spot passed down through generations. Then it vanished. Not in some mythological catastrophe, but through the same gradual process that's threatening Bangladesh, the Maldives, Venice, Miami Beach. Water rising centimetre by centimetre, year by year, until suddenly entire regions are uninhabitable, until the fishing villages your great-grandparents built are underwater, until the fields that fed your family for centuries grow nothing but marsh grass, until you have to choose between staying and drowning or leaving and becoming refugees. This is happening right now to tens of millions of people. The Pacific Islands are watching their countries disappear beneath the waves. Coastal communities from Louisiana to Indonesia are abandoning towns that have existed for centuries. And just like Doggerland, these aren't marginal territories or empty wastelands. These are rich, productive landscapes where people have built entire cultures. The people of Doggerland adapted for as long as they could. The archaeological evidence shows them adjusting their settlement patterns, moving from permanent villages to more mobile camps, changing their hunting and fishing strategies as the resources shifted. They were smart, resourceful, flexible. All the things we're told we need to be in the face of climate change, and it wasn't enough. Because there's a limit to how much adaptation is possible when the land itself goes away, when the forests you hunt become saltwater marshes, when the rivers you fish become sea channels, eventually you run out of strategies. Eventually you either move or you die. The really sobering part? Doggerland's people had time, thousands of years to adjust, to slowly relocate, to find new territories and integrate with other communities. Modern sea level rise is happening faster, much faster. The IPCC projects up to a metre of rise by 2100, maybe more if ice sheet collapse accelerates. That's within the lifetime of children being born today. And we have way more people trying to go way fewer places. When Doggerland flooded, its tens of thousands of inhabitants could spread across sparsely populated regions of Britain and continental Europe. Where do 200 million climate refugees go when their coastal homelands become uninhabitable? Where do the people of Bangladesh move when a third of their country is underwater? There's no empty territory left to absorb them. But here's where Doggerland's story offers something besides warning. It also offers hope, because those people survived. They lost their homeland, yes. They were forced to abandon everything their ancestors had built. But they didn't disappear. They adapted, integrated, became part of new communities. Their genes, their knowledge, their cultures survived the transition. Modern genetic studies show that Britain's population carries DNA from Doggerland's refugees. Those flood survivors didn't just show up and die out. They intermarried with existing populations, had children, passed down their skills and stories. Within a few generations, the distinction between refugees from the drowned land and natives had dissolved. They became one people, enriched by the combination. This happened because the existing populations were small enough and resource bases rich enough that newcomers could be absorbed. Britain at 8,000 years ago had maybe a few thousand inhabitants total. Adding Doggerland's refugees doubled or tripled the population, but there was room. Forests full of game, rivers full of fish, plenty of territory for everyone. We don't have that luxury anymore, but we do have something Doggerland's people didn't: technology, infrastructure, the ability to plan and coordinate on scales they couldn't imagine. We can build seawalls, relocate populations systematically, create new settlements in interior regions before they're needed. We can, if we choose to, manage this transition in ways that minimize suffering and preserve cultures. Whether we will choose to is another question entirely. Doggerland also teaches us about impermanence in more subtle ways. Britain's entire national identity is bound up in being an island. This sceptred isle, fortress built by nature, all that. The idea of Britain as separate, distinct, protected by the sea is fundamental to how Britons understand themselves. But Britain was only an island for about 8,000 of the last million years. For most of human history in this region, Britain was a peninsula. People walked there from France and Germany. Animals migrated freely. Culturally and genetically, Britain was just another part of northwest Europe, no more isolated than Belgium or the Netherlands. The North Sea that now defines Britain as separate, that stopped Napoleon and Hitler, that makes Brexit even possible as a concept. That's a recent development in historical terms. Temporary, really. During the next ice age, whenever that comes, the waters will retreat again, and Britain will rejoin the continent. The English Channel will become a river valley, the North Sea will turn to tundra, and you'll be able to walk from London to Amsterdam again. Nothing is permanent, not coastlines, not nations, not the geographical features we base our identities on. This should make us humble. All our borders and boundaries are drawn on landscapes that are fundamentally temporary, that shift and change on timescales longer than our political systems, but shorter than our species' existence. The archaeological side of Doggerland's legacy is equally important. Beneath the North Sea lies one of the richest archaeological sites in Europe, a complete record of Mesolithic life preserved in sediments and protected by water. but it's under threat, not from rising seas this time, but from development. Fishing trawlers drag heavy nets across the seafloor, smashing artifacts that have survived 10,000 years. Oil and gas companies drill into sediments that contain human settlements. Offshore wind farms, even as they help address climate change, disturb archaeological deposits. Every year we lose irreplaceable evidence of how our ancestors lived. Some countries are starting to take this seriously. The Netherlands has protected zones where bottom trawling is prohibited to preserve submerged archaeological sites. Britain has designated certain areas of Doggerland as heritage assets, theoretically protecting them from development. But enforcement is minimal and the sites are still deteriorating. This matters because Doggerland holds answers to questions we're still asking. How did Mesolithic communities organise themselves? What did their belief systems look like? How did they adapt to environmental change? What technologies did they develop that we've lost? The answers are down there, in the mud and sand of the North Sea, slowly being destroyed before we can recover them. And we're getting better at the recovery part. Marine archaeology has advanced dramatically in the last few decades. Multi-beam sonar can map the seafloor in incredible detail, revealing ancient riverbeds and settlement patterns. Core samples can be extracted with minimal disturbance, preserving delicate organic materials. DNA analysis can tell us about population movements and interactions. But there's so much we still don't know. We don't know where the major settlements were. We don't know how population density varied across the landscape. We don't know exactly how and when different regions were abandoned. We don't know what stories the last inhabitants told about the rising waters, what myths they created to explain their changing world, whether they understood what was happening or saw it as divine punishment. We don't know what they called their land. Doggerland is our name, coined by archaeologists from Dogger Bank, itself named after Dutch fishing boats called doggers. But those people had a name for their home. Probably several names, actually, for different regions and landscapes. Those names are gone, drowned along with everything else, and we'll never recover them unless we find written records, which seems impossibly unlikely for a pre-literate culture. This is the tragedy of lost cultures. Not just that they ended, but that they ended so completely we can barely reconstruct them. Every story, every song, every joke and proverb and prayer is gone. We have their bones and stone tools and occasional bits of wooden artifacts, but we don't have them. The fullness of their lives, the richness of their experiences, their hopes and fears and dreams, all of it drowned in the North Sea and lost to time, unless it isn't. Because genes carry memory, culture carries memory, language carries memory. Britain's population today is descended partly from Doggerland's refugees, and maybe, buried in folklore and tradition and genetic expression, fragments of that drowned culture survive. Maybe some British folk tales about flooded lands and lost kingdoms preserve actual memories passed down through 400 generations. Maybe some words or place names or cultural practices trace back to Doggerland and its people. Probably not. Probably 8,000 years is too long for that kind of cultural continuity. But maybe. And that possibility, however slim, should remind us that we're all connected to deeper past than we usually acknowledge. Every person alive today is descended from someone who survived impossible things. Climate disasters, floods, droughts, plagues, famines. Our ancestors lived through the Younger Dryas, watched glaciers advance and retreat, adapted to environmental changes that would destroy modern civilization. We carry that resilience in our genes. We inherit that adaptability. The same species that colonized every environment on Earth, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, that survived ice ages and volcanic winters and the flooding of entire countries, that's us. We are the descendants of survivors, the inheritors of knowledge accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years of environmental crisis management, which means we can adapt to what's coming. We can survive the changes our own actions have set in motion. The question isn't whether our species will make it through the current climate crisis. We're too widespread, too technologically advanced, too adaptable to go extinct from rising seas and shifting climate zones. The question is how many of us will make it, and at what cost? How much suffering will we accept before we act? How many Doggerlands will we let drown before we stabilise the climate? How many people will we force to become refugees before we admit that this isn't a problem we can ignore? Doggerland teaches us that climate change isn't an abstract threat for distant generations. It's the erasure of homelands, the destruction of cultures, the forced displacement of entire populations. It's watching your world literally disappear beneath the waves while you scramble to save what you can and abandon the rest. And it teaches us that this has happened before, will happen again, and that life continues. Changed, diminished maybe, but continuing. The people who walked across Doggerland are gone, but their descendants are everywhere. Britain, France, Germany, Spain. Probably every country in Western Europe carries genetic traces of Doggerland's refugees. They lost their homeland, but they didn't lose themselves. That's the dual legacy of Doggerland: warning and hope, catastrophe and survival. A reminder that the world we know is more fragile than we think, and that humans are more resilient than we fear. Both lessons matter. Both truths need to be held simultaneously as we face our own rising seas and warming world. The waters that drowned Doggerland are still there, still rising, still teaching the same lessons to anyone willing to listen. The question is whether we're smart enough, cooperative enough, and forward-thinking enough to learn them before we're forced to live them. And so, we reach the end of our journey through Doggerland. From its birth in ice 20,000 years ago to its final drowning 8,000 years later, we've walked through a land that no longer exists. A place that was home to thousands of humans who never imagined their world could simply disappear beneath the waves. Think about what we've witnessed. We watched the ice sheets retreat and expose fresh tundra that would become grassland, then forest. We saw the first humans arrive, following herds of mammoth and reindeer across a landscape that stretched unbroken from what is now France to what is now Norway. We walked through oak forests where brown bears hunted and aurochs grazed. We stood on riverbanks where families built their homes, confident they would last for generations. We watched children play in valleys that are now 60 feet underwater. We saw hunters track prey across hills that modern fishing trawlers pass over unknowingly. We witnessed the golden age of Doggerland, when it was perhaps the richest hunting ground in all of Europe, supporting populations that might have numbered in the tens of thousands. Then we watched it die. First slowly, as the seas rose inch by inch, year by year, forcing communities to abandon coastal settlements and move inland. Then catastrophically, as the Storegga tsunami roared across the North Sea, drowning thousands in a single morning and transforming the landscape beyond recognition. Finally, inevitably, as the last island slipped beneath the waves around 5,500 BC, leaving only Britain separated from the continent and the memory of Doggerland erased from human consciousness. For 6,000 years nobody knew it had ever existed. Fishermen dragged their nets across its drowned forests. Ships sailed over its buried settlements. The North Sea kept its secrets perfectly, until we developed the technology to peer beneath the waves and see what had been hidden, until trawler nets started bringing up Stone Age tools and mammoth bones, until we realized that the shallow waters between Britain and Europe concealed an entire lost world. There's something profoundly haunting about Doggerland's story. Not just tragic, though it's certainly that. Imagine being one of the last inhabitants of those final islands, watching the sea claim more land with each passing year, knowing your children's children would have no homeland to return to. But there's also something inspiring about it. Those people survived for as long as they possibly could. They adapted, moved, rebuilt, persisted. And when Doggerland finally drowned completely, they didn't vanish. They became the early Britons, the coastal Europeans, the ancestors of millions alive today. We are all descended from people who survived impossible changes, climate catastrophes that nearly wiped out our species, ice ages that transformed continents, rising seas that drowned entire landscapes. Our ancestors watched their worlds end and somehow found the strength to build new ones. That's written in our DNA. That capacity for adaptation, for survival, for looking at a flooded valley or a drowned forest and saying, okay, where do we go next? Doggerland teaches us that nothing is permanent. Not coastlines, not islands, not even continents in their current configurations. The world is always changing, always moving, always transforming itself in ways that seem impossibly slow until suddenly they're catastrophically fast. But it also teaches us that humans are resilient. We've survived worse than we can imagine, and we've done it by being clever, adaptable, and remarkably stubborn about staying alive. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, picture the North Sea. Not as it appears on modern maps, but as it really is. A vast cemetery of human history, concealing beneath its grey waters an entire world that once teemed with life. Forests where the wind once whispered through oak leaves. Rivers where salmon ran thick enough to catch with your hands. Valleys where smoke rose from cooking fires and children's laughter echoed off hillsides. It's all still there in a way, buried under silt and sand, slowly fossilizing, waiting for archaeologists to piece together its story fragment by fragment. Every fishing net that snags on a submerged forest, every core sample that reveals ancient pollen, every bone that washes up on a modern beach, they're all messages from Doggerland. Reminders that this lost world really existed, that real people really lived there, and that their story deserves to be remembered. Before you go, if this journey through deep time has sparked your curiosity, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Are you in Britain, separated from Europe by the descendants of the waters that drowned Doggerland? Or somewhere else entirely? Perhaps a place that will look completely different 8,000 years from now. And subscribe if you want more history designed to ease you into sleep while filling your mind with ancient wonders. Good night from the drowned world. May your dreams be filled with lost landscapes and forgotten peoples, and may you wake remembering that we're all just temporary inhabitants of a planet that reinvents itself constantly, beautifully, inevitably. Sleep well, sleep